Hi, I'm Bruce Jamieson from ISSRC at the University of Calgary. This is a talk that Alan Jones and I gave at the International Snow Science Workshop in Anchorage, Alaska in September 2012. Alan is a consultant with Dynamic Avalanche Consulting. Vulnerability is the probable consequences given that you're caught. So if you can imagine a size D3 avalanche coming down this slope here towards the two trucks and the one person. I'll zoom in a bit here. The greatest vulnerability is to the person standing outside between the trucks. The person in the smaller truck has lower vulnerability, and the person in the larger truck has lower vulnerability still. Vulnerability is the probable consequences. So I will give a formal definition of vulnerability, then I'll introduce a few risk concepts, and then I'll review some recent progress in quantitative vulnerability for buildings, people in cars, people in the backcountry. And for people in backcountry, their vulnerability is strongly affected by a reporting bias, which I will cover. And then I'll finish with an example of quantitative vulnerability for a workplace risk assessment. So here's the definition of vulnerability by the International Union of Geological Sciences in 1997. Been around a long time and is really widely used. It's really caught on. So vulnerability is the degree of loss for whatever gets hit by the avalanche. It's given on a scale of 0 to 1. 0 is for no loss, 1 is for total loss, and for property, it's the value of the property. For a person affected, it's the probability that a particular life, that is the element at risk, will be lost. But notice that it's given that the person is affected by the avalanche or within the area, the property affected by the avalanche. So it's the probable consequences given that the element of value is hit by the avalanche. When we're dealing with risk or vulnerability, which is a component of risk, we're often quite happy to have a quantitative estimate for the average value. In this case here, that's 0.2. In the open distribution with the black line in here, we see it's quite narrow. The values it can take on is quite narrow, around 0.2. In the blue distribution over and through here, it's much more widely distributed around the average value and takes on a maximum value, almost double what it does for the narrow of the two distributions. So while we're content to get an average value, it's advantageous if we can know more about the distribution or spread of values around the average or the mean value. The components of avalanche risk are the probability of the avalanche or event, its exposure, and then the vulnerability. And while we're quite happy to have the expected or average values for each of these three components, it's advantageous to know more about the distribution for each of these three. If any one of these three components can only be estimated qualitatively, then the risk can only be estimated qualitatively. If, however, we can be quantitative about all three, then risk itself can be quantitative. And this talk here is primarily about quantitative vulnerability. Now, going back to 1981, Garrick and Kaplan, they indicated that we should break down risk into scenarios. It could be a dry avalanche and a wet avalanche, a powder avalanche, or a dense flow avalanche, or in this example here, a size D2 avalanche and a size D3. There might also be a D4 avalanche in our analysis. And here we see, and again, these are just concocted distributions in here, the D2 avalanche has higher frequency. It's shifted to the right compared to the D3 because bigger avalanches are usually less frequent. I did not change the distributions here for the exposure. And for the vulnerability here, we see that the vulnerability is shifted to the right. That is, the fraction of loss is greater for the size D3 avalanches than it is for the size D2s. Briefly on the vulnerability of buildings. This is the Kangir-Sulujjuaq avalanche that struck the gym and school in that northern town in January 1st, 1991. We notice that the roof is intact, the building is intact, the foundation intact, but there's one wall that is seriously damaged. So the fraction of loss for this building is quite low. We can see a graph here of the vulnerability of buildings based on the impact pressure here. For quite low impact pressures here, a few kilopascals, light construction has low damage in here, and so does reinforced concrete destruction, breaking the windows, perhaps ripping off the chimney. As the impact pressure increases, light construction experiences high damage, whereas reinforced concrete, we have to get up around 30 kilopascals till we start to see increasing damage. For both of these two, once the damage reaches 50%, it jumps up to a fraction loss of 1 because the building is likely to be replaced and rebuilt. And in Wilhelm's 1998 study, he actually shows different kinds of constructions in the middle here. Now, for people in cars, this is from Swiss data here from Reinberger's 2009 study here. For a low pressure avalanche, and 3 kilopascals is a fairly pushy powder avalanche here, we see a 5% probability of death. For a powder snow avalanche, it's 9%, a dense flow avalanche, 27%, and when the avalanches can push a car off a road and down a steep slope, perhaps into the creek, it jumps up to about 35%. Now let's talk about the vulnerability for people inside buildings. This depends on the strength of the walls and the orientation of the walls to the avalanche flow. And here in Sudovik in Iceland in 1995, we see that the avalanche flow was parallel to the stronger walls of this particular building. Vulnerability for people inside buildings can be analyzed in terms of the strength of the walls and the orientation of the walls, but we'll start with a simpler example here. For people inside buildings, the probability of death to an individual, that is the PDI, the vulnerability, increases with the size of the avalanche here. As we go from a 2.5 to a 3 to a 3.5 and upwards, we see for a typical Icelandic house construction, in the white bars here, the vulnerability, the probability of death increases, and it increases more slowly here for people inside reinforced concrete buildings. For small avalanches, the building acts as a defense to reduce the vulnerability, but once the avalanche breaks into the building, the walls of the room the people are in actually form a terrain trap. Okay, now let's talk about vulnerability for people in the backcountry. They could be recreationists or they could be workers, although most of our data is for recreationists in the backcountry. So here we see a graph of the vulnerability, the probability of death to an individual. This is a log scale over here. For size D2 avalanches here on the log scale, that's 0.07 or 7%. For size D3 avalanches, that's 0.43 or 43%. If we combine the D2 avalanches with the 2.5s, with the 3s, and the 3.5s, we get an average for all sizes of 19%. Thinking back to the 1970s and the early 1980s, when I was ski cutting a lot of avalanches, both at work and in the backcountry, and as well my friends and colleagues were as well. And yes, we got caught and carried around in some of them. And we were caught in quite a few, and the death rate couldn't have been anything like 7%. It had to be something very much lower. So my experience was telling me one thing, and the Canadian Avalanche Center's data was telling me another. I was puzzling over this when Cora Shea walked into my office. I explained the puzzle to her, and it took her several seconds to answer. Well, maybe the reporting rate for non-fatal involvements was less than for fatal involvements. It was like a light bulb came on over my head, but it wasn't my light bulb. It was one of Cora Shea's many light bulbs. So I've asked around and asked people what they think the reporting rate for non-fatal involvements to the Canadian Avalanche Centre is. The number 5% keeps coming up. So here we see the adjusted statistics here for 10% and 5% of the reporting rate for non-fatal involvements. So for 10% reporting rate for D2 avalanches, the probability drops off to 0.007 or 0.7%. For 5% reporting rate, it drops to 0.003. These numbers were much more realistic. They fitted with my experience and also with estimates of the reporting rate for non-fatal avalanches to the Canadian Avalanche Centre. So what about ski cutting? Just how risky is ski cutting? Well, if you're targeting size 1 and 1.5 avalanches, and realistically, you're going to be surprised and get the occasional size 2 avalanches, and perhaps even larger. If you apply these estimates in through here, you'll get a much more realistic estimate of the risk while ski cutting. Okay, let's take what we've learned about quantitative vulnerability for individuals in the backcountry and apply it to a hypothetical example of a workplace risk assessment. First, we'll start by considering a single exposure to an avalanche start zone, and this avalanche control worker here is downweighting as he moves across the start zone to a safe place. Now, if the avalanche danger is moderate, according to a paper that Cora Shea, Jörg Schweitzer, and I worked on for the ISSW in Davos in 2009, the probability of being caught, given one exposure, is about 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 4. Okay. Now, applying the previous slide for 5 to 10% reporting rate for non-fatal exposures here, these drop off by a factor of about 100. The probability of a death for one exposure is about 10 to the minus 7 to about 10 to the minus 5 here. Okay, now let's consider a field team of 2 workers, and on 100 days, each of these workers are exposed to 2 start zones. So in a winter, there'd be 400 exposures here. If we're talking about moderate avalanche danger, the probability of death given 400 exposures and the assumptions we made so far is about 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 3. So that's for a winter with about 400 exposures while the avalanche danger is moderate. So I've just graphed that up here again with a log scale over here, only this time it's for quantitative risk. This shows the expected value or the average value here, and this shows the middle 50% of the estimates here. And that's for 400 exposures when the avalanche danger is moderate. If we change this from 400 exposures while the avalanche danger is moderate to 200 while it's moderate and 200 while it's considerable, the risk jumps, the risk of death here jumps almost by a factor of 10. There's the average value there, and there's the middle 50% of the estimates. Now, this is quantitative vulnerability, and we could apply balloon packs. We know the reduction in quantitative vulnerability for balloon packs, and that could be applied to this particular workplace risk assessment. Okay, some takeaway points here. First, vulnerability is one of the 3 components of avalanche risk. It's advantageous to break down risk into scenarios. We could do it by powder avalanches and dense flow avalanches, by wet avalanches and dry avalanches, or we could do it by destructive size. That's one popular way of breaking down risk into scenarios. There's been a lot of good progress in quantitative vulnerability in the last 10 years for buildings, people in cars, and people in the backcountry. However, for people in the backcountry, the vulnerability, that is the probability of death to an individual, is sensitive to the reporting rate of non-fatal involvements. And then I showed you an example of workplace risk using quantitative vulnerability. That same example showed an example of carrying uncertainty through the risk analysis. And so we don't just get an exact expected value, but we see something about the range of values that may be taken on. And that's quite important for managing risk, to know if we have a really narrowly confined risk or if it can vary quite widely from our expected value. These are the good folks that support avalanche research that I work with, and a special thanks to Pascal Hageley. I was struggling with an SQL query to the Canadian Avalanche Center database, and Pascal came to my rescue.